Matt's opinion will be important here also, for example. The units, the minimum units.
I'd rather have an in-room decision and confirm it on the mailing list than start from scratch on the mailing list. Because it's really hard.
We need this fast.
Yes.
Okay, so
I don't think it's gonna stop.
So are we in the end instead of beginning?
Well, at least as soon as Alexei is back.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, yeah, I don't have strong preference so either way.
Can I type Control / on this keyboard with one hand? And the answer is no.
Can I?
Control /
Where the hell is that? So you to make Finnish keyboard.
Yes. That's the wrong one. No, that's also the right one.
It's not version of this. So we start with the class, yeah? Very easy.
Okay, welcome to the second meeting of the co-working group in this week and also the last session in this week. I think most people have seen all these node variables and so on, but if you're new to this, please read it. The objective of today's meeting was essentially to pick up items that happened this week, and that's why it will be a little bit less organized and a little bit more chaotic than other parts of the meeting, because during an IETF week, of course, nobody has time to actually create tons of slides and so on. So this is the agenda that is on the agenda sheet, and we actually have two items we want to add to that, which is a really quick discussion. Hi, Christian. A really quick discussion of where we are with resource directory. The main resource directory document is in AD evaluation, as we said Wednesday. But there is this other resource directory document, and we should briefly talk about that. So I think we can do that first. And the other thing we want to do is pick up the discussion about the CNML unit thing, but we will only do that when Alexei is back from the presentation he has to give right now in the admin working group. Anything else we should be doing today? We probably do have time at the end, so if you have a favorite topic that you always wanted to present or discuss, now is the time. No, I'm not going to give an impromptu presentation about the new SI system that was introduced in May this year. Okay. Yeah, we are going to skip that. Resource directory, Christian, these are your slides.
Good morning from Vienna. Do you hear
You're
me?
a bit quiet. We can see you very well.
Then hang on. I think I can fix the.
It's getting better.
One more moment. How about now?
Much better. What time is it where you are?
05:30 around. So good morning.
I can't quite suppress the comment that you look that way.
Okay, so on resource directory, next slide, please. As you mentioned, there has been an error. We are in AD evaluation after working group last call. We've published 3 new draft versions during the working group last call period, which were mainly addressing things like clarify this, add a bit more detail here or there. Now Alexei has been as kind as to finish or is to do an AD review. With that, there is next slide, please. A lot of editorial things that we need to fix, and one large question that is the question of the normativity of RD, DNSSD. To summarize, what we are saying about DNSSD is that it is something that is being worked on, and it is one of the ways that you can use to find your resource directory. So if you're in a managed network, then you should, it is recommended that you use the RD address option of neighbor discovery or use Anycast. And there is also one of the recommended mechanism is RD DNSSD. And the comment was that this looks like a normative reference, and it should be, because right now it is an informative reference. So what shall we do about it? The status of RD DNSSD is that it's being worked on. So Peter refreshed it with all the outcome of the previous discussions, but it's still not in a state where we can expect to have it published in the next 1 or 2 IETFs. Probably longer. So having this as a normative reference would slow down the RD DNS RD process quite a bit. Now the possible ways to go forward here are to sit it out, which I don't think we should do. To basically convince Alexei that we don't want to that this is really not something that is of normative relevance, even though we say that is one of the recommended options, or to remove the recommendation that to use this and to just say that there may be other ones that other discovery options that will be provided with new documents that could become important as well. So that's the big question for discussion, and also the thing where I'd like to ask you for your input on what could we do about this. So input, please.
Carsten Bormann without a chair hat because I'm a co-author on this document. So Jaime is the chair for this. Normative references are really bad. We made the mistake in RFC 7252, which had a normative reference for what became RFC 7250, which is interesting. It has an RFC number three numbers below COAP. So why was that a problem? The problem was that some random quarrel in the security area that was completely without effect on the real world delayed this document for a year. And these things happen. So a normative reference is a significant...
Just a second, let me cut you there for a second. We don't have minute takers because nobody volunteered at the beginning. We need one for this. I'm taking some minutes.
Yes.
I don't want to take it alone.
Sorry.
So please, those of you who have laptops, you could raise your hand, your head for a second and then think about whether you want to take minutes and then raise your hand, please. Thanks, Avalo.
This hand has to be raised.
Okay, so both of you, please take minutes. This is important because we want to have, this is going to the list later, so.
Right. Yeah, so a normative reference really is a big liability, and we should incur that in situations where we actually need it. Now, these documents were meant to run synchronously, and it turned out after a while that for person power reasons, we couldn't keep this up. So I think it is really useful to maintain that forward reference because yes, once that other document is out, it's probably a good idea to use it. But we need to find a way to describe this in such a way that it does not become a normative reference. And one way is to say that there are other ways to do discovery, such as, and then we do the informative reference to the draft. And these also should be considered when finding a resource directory. So just as a reminder, we are not talking about service discovery or resource discovery at the moment. We are talking about resource directory discovery, which is a pretty fluffy thing anyway. We are not giving very, very precise guidance here anyway, but we are mostly listing ways this can be done. And whether a particular resource directory that is discovered is actually useful for a node, that's a completely different question. And there will be implementation-specific considerations that play a role here. So I think just pointing to the thing and using language that says this is one way to configure things, I think is the way forward.
Ari Keränen, 2 data points. I can second Carsten that normative references can be an issue. I have a co-author of a draft in Elwick that has been 4 years waiting for RD to finish. That was maybe a mistake to put a normative reference, which was not strictly needed. It was nice, but it wasn't strictly needed, so would have made sense to make it informative. And then on discovery at large, as you mentioned, there's probably other documents coming on discovery. I think you're spot on that. There's a lot of discovery discussions ongoing on this space right now. I mean, in the Web of Things, on the discovering TDs, on hackathons, many discovery discussions, etc. So most likely we will have more discovery-related documents coming in this space in the near future. And that's something maybe take into account here.
I'm Stuart Cheshire from Apple. Carsten, you said something that confused me, and maybe you can explain. You said this reference to RD DNSSD is not about discovering the resources, it's about discovering the directory, but that's not remotely what that document says. If you want to discover the directory, that is a 5-minute task. We can design that right here. You pick a service type, pick a unique string, register it with IANA, and then call the API on your platform to say, I have a thing, it's called a resource directory, and I'm either offering one or I'm looking for one. Done. I've just explained everything you need to know to advertise a service, and there are 1,000 other services that advertise that way. There's really no, if there's an internet draft for this, it's not even 1 page long. It says, here's the service type, publish it and search for it. What that draft talks about is how you map the resources that would be in a resource directory into their equivalents using DNS service discovery so that you don't have a resource directory at all. So it's not about discovering the resource directory, it's about making the resource directory unnecessary. So I'm not standing here expressing an opinion on either side of that. I'm just confused because what you said doesn't reflect what's being discussed here.
I think I can clarify this from here. What we had in the resource directory draft so far was to say that for the link to the resource directory that we are expressing in the discovery process for the resource directory, if the way to express that in RD DNSSD is just as if that link were put into a resource directory. And that means that all the ways of how is a path encoded in the text record, etc., we didn't want to spell out again. And in fact, we had spelled out wrongly by using an outdated, by referring to the old way that RDTNSSD did that. So yes, we could do that, but then we would probably pin down the flexibility of RDTNSSD, because that is still in the process of deciding are there subtypes involved or not, and how does protocol negotiation fit into that, and that is not fully done yet.
Okay, so thanks for that explanation. That makes sense now. My suggestion would be, it seems that discovering the resource directory doesn't need all the full generality of the subtypes and the text record path and all the other things you were talking about. Maybe there's a way forward where you define the subset that's needed to discover a resource directory, and that might be the empty set. It might be just, here's a service type, registered with IANA, done. And then let the DNSSD resource directory establish the full generality of how other things are encoding. Because I think if you want to publish this RFC and have implementations that are discoverable on the network by clients that are looking for one, then not saying how to do that leaves people guessing. So specify the subset that you need to specify to have a workable solution. That would be my recommendation.
So I gather we're talking about this paragraph in 4.1?
Yeah, a bit further down. So here it says that this is described there, and if you go to the end of that section, a bit up, yeah, here. So those are the 3 points that are recommended, because they were added rather late in, when there was the question about how should application authors just do this, as give some guidance on what to do and not only list options. And this is the guidance that was added.
Yeah, so what Stuart has proposed would be to take the relevant paragraphs from RDD and SSD and put them here.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Procedurally, it doesn't make sense. From what would actually be in there, I'm not sure whether this will cover all the aspects of protocol negotiation that kind of follow from the RDD and SSD mapping. So this is, there hasn't been a published update to RDD and SSD, so what you're looking at is not the very latest version. Peter has already removed some of the old parts in there that are that we found at the last IETF were not really relevant anymore. But basically the remaining question that would need to be solved for this to be copyable into RD is, how do we express the protocol part? Do we just register a DNSSD service type that says, and this always unconditionally goes to coop : / and not coop plus TCP or anything else, to build the full URI? Would that be better done with subtypes? So what I take from the discussion we had with Stuart last time was that subtypes are not designed for protocol negotiation, and we shouldn't use it for that, and just have a service type for each individual protocol this is bound to. So if that's what we would go for, and it looks like that, but our RDD and SSD isn't on the direct way to publication yet, so it's not set in stone, then that would be the way.
I think I can offer you a suggestion about that. I'll start with a simple example. If we take a very familiar service like SSH, and you ask, how do you advertise that? And the answer is, it's unique IANA service type _SSH._TCP. You put that in the API when you offer it, you put that in the API when you look for it. Done. That's how you discover SSH. So here, you're talking about something that isn't an issue with SSH, because SSH runs over TCP. It doesn't run over UDP or SCTP or QUIC. So if I've got an SSH client and you've got an SSH server, we know they can connect, as long as they're on a platform that has TCP. The way I look at what you're describing here is, I would fill out the IANA form, have a string assigned, record in this RFC what the string is so that implementers know what it is. And that string means resource directory over CoAP over UDP. Now, if in the future something is implemented that is CoAP over TCP, that is a different service type string in the IANA registry, because it's a different implementation. And the reason I say that is, if you have a resource directory that only supports CoAP over TCP, and I have a client that only supports CoAP over UDP, they can't talk to each other. So for me to discover you is of zero benefit to the user. The user wants to find things that they can talk to. So if in the future you have CoAP over QUIC, if I don't support CoAP over QUIC, discovering that is useless as well. So it's common to think that you can have one application protocol running over 3 different transports, and that's the same thing. The way I look at it, that's not the same thing. That's 3 different things. And the client can indicate which of those 3 or all of them it's interested in, and the server can indicate which ones it offers. So that is my recommendation when questions like this come up. For NFS can run over TCP or UDP. In the rare cases that question comes up, that's the guidance I give people. And it means in this document, you specify 1, or if you're supporting TCP as well, you specify 2. I'm guessing RD over QUIC is not yet a thing. Okay, so you don't need to specify that. That could be a future RFC if and when that becomes real. But for the ones that are real today, specify those in concrete terms.
Yeah. I think that this is where RDD and SSD is going. I'm just saying, if we say that here, then we are making that decision for RDD and SSD. looks like me now that like this is a way we can go forward. I'd like to have a bit more on this about this on the mailing list maybe. But yeah, one
Yeah,
thing
it sounds to me from what I'm hearing that there are some details to be sorted out, and in that case, this text we're looking at on the screen is in fact a normative forward reference to something that's not yet decided. So if it's possible, and I know you don't want to slow down the document, if it's possible, don't try to boil the ocean. If there are open issues in RD, DNSSD, then those can take their time being discussed. But if you can figure out the subset that is necessary to find an RD server, and I'll come back to this example again. I just told you how to find an SSH server, and it didn't require a working group and lots of discussions. It's, here's the string, ask the network for that string. If there's some reason that it is not that simple, then we need to resolve that, because it shouldn't be that complicated.
So the reason why I think it's not that simple and it's not exactly like the various this over DNS over or NFS is that unlike those protocols in CoAP, the applications can rely on the CoAP protocol to have the same usable semantics over all those transports, and they can rely on proxies. So even if a resource directory client discovers a CoAP plus TCP if we used subtypes whatsoever to do protocol negotiation over DNSSD, and I'm not saying we should, I'm just saying that this would be an option we should still consider, is that if the client discovers the CoAP plus TCP URI but has a proxy it can use, it could just go to the proxy and say, okay, please do my RD registration for my CoAP URI over that proxy, and that would still work with caveats. But those caveats are generic to using
What if the
a
client
proxy.
discovers CoAP over QUIC and its proxy doesn't support QUIC? I think there's a bit of a magic wand waving and then a miracle happens step here, which is A can't talk to B, but A assumes that something else on the network can. And that seems like, certainly you could set up a demo where you constructed it that way, but as a vendor shipping a product, can you assume that every customer has these magic gateways that know everything?
No, but it can still then fail at a later step. As I said, I just want to make sure that we don't overlook this possibility, but it looks to me more and more like we just do as you suggest.
So I just typed into the notepad what I think the substance is we're talking about.
So you're asking about _UDP and _TCP. Those will not be sufficient to cover the requirements of CoAP because it can use more transports than UDP and TCP. And in DNSSD, the _UDP and _TCP is generally, as I understand, considered something that was designed with the mindset of the time when it was designed, and _UDP is _UDP and _TCP is what most applications use because that's what's available. But if there is anything more like CoAP over WebSockets, we still need to disambiguate between WebSockets and TCP, plain TCP, for example.
What Carsten is suggesting there would work for the case that we're talking about. What Christian is talking about, it is true, but I don't want to confuse the discussion here. If we could go back in time 20 years, then I would not have inherited the _TCP and UDP from the SRV spec. I would have just had a single label _SRV for service, and that label would just be a placeholder to give a delegation point in the DNS hierarchy, and it would have no semantic meaning. So we have this little historical footnote that you point out. It's not actually a problem for what we're talking about right now. Right now, Christian, you're talking about all the different transports that CURP can use. Can you list all those transports that are currently specified and implemented? How big is the set that we're talking about?
It's 2 times 3. It's UDP, TCP, and WebSockets, all in their secured and unsecured versions. So it's CoAP over UDP plus DTLS, that's CoAP S, CoAP over UDP, and TCP, TLS, and WebSockets, possibly with TLS.
Okay, so 6 is getting to be kind of a long list of 6 independent services to list. So I agree that's that does make this more complicated than SSH, which really doesn't have 6 different ways of connecting to it. So I'll offer this as an example of how other things have been done. When your client does DNS update, it needs to find the server for the host name you're using that handles DNS update. And that can be done in clear text, or it can be done over TCP, or it can be done over TLS, over TCP to prevent eavesdropping. So there are 3 different service types, because even though to a human being, DNS update is just a thing. I want to update my host name, insecure, secure, I don't care. Maybe you should care. At a protocol level, if you've got a client that only uses DNS over TLS for updates, and the server doesn't support that, then they can't talk to each other. So the client is specifically looking for, and I think the service type is DNS-update-TLS. So we have 3 service types. We have DNSUpdate.UDP, DNSUpdate.TCP, and DNSUpdate-TLS.TCP. And the client looks typically only for the TLS one if it wants to protect against eavesdropping. So that is a model for you to think about. I'm not saying you blindly apply it here, but I'm giving that as one data point of what has been done. For DNS push notifications, we actually only define that to use TLS. It doesn't have an insecure option. So, I'm mentioning that as a data point to consider. I know in Core ID you have different constraints, and having the insecure version available makes sense. Anyway, I think.
So the problem here would be that we tend to use the resource type, and the -TLS we have in my example here that would impinge on that resource type.
I think we've moved forward in RDD and SSD on explicitly noting the service type that a URI is usable for in the export, and not trying to come up with a service type from the resource type, because those just don't match so well that we can have a one-on-one mapping. And even if they did, it would be very hard to mechanically convert them and to sync the registries. So it will just be another attribute.
Maybe another way to look at this is pretend the core RD DNSSD document never existed, or suppose it does exist but it doesn't get published. Take that off the table. What do you want to write in this document about how a client would discover the RD on the network so it can then talk to it to do further discovery? So at least figure that bit out. And I understand the details you're talking about that make it more complicated than the IPP or the SSH case. But whatever those complications are, put aside the full generality of RD DNSSD, which tries to map all of these other attributes. Just forget all that. Just ask the simple question. I have a computer on the network. I've got a Raspberry Pi or something. I've got my home gateway running an RD. How do I find it? And maybe if the question is scoped down that way, it won't take quite so long to come to agreement on the answer.
Yeah, I think that's useful. And I think unless there's another opinion, I think we can take the details to the list. And I think this should be manageable, that it shouldn't delay resource directory a lot.
Yes.
Okay. So it seems that was a useful discussion to have.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, should I go back to your slides, or are we done? Oops, we're done. Okay. Good. Yeah, so we wanted to do the same more units discussion, but I think Alexei hasn't returned from Acme yet. So what we'll do is we're going to do the core applications discussion now. And we will use a format for that we actually have been using in interims, but have not yet been using in face-to-face meetings, which is we will just look at the notepad where Klaus has already written up the complete results of the discussion, and we will... What was that?
The button body next to the projector.
Yeah, but why did you have to press a button to...
Magic.
Oh, you moved the table. That never moved the table where the projector is. Yeah, got it. So go ahead. Oh, maybe given that Alexei is back, maybe we do the other thing first, so we have the full rest of the time. So, where are we? Send me more units.
Okay, so this is to continue the discussion we had in the previous core session about the more units and how and if and should we indicate the fact that there are different kind of units that we are now proposing in the CNML units registry. So basically, we do have two options here. Either we indicate the fact that we're using them, that was referred to as U2 and asterisk options in the previous session, or we use units from the second registry as such. And maybe one thing good to note here is I also sent an email on the mailing list about an hour ago to give everyone a bit of background on this who didn't follow the previous discussion. Maybe one thing to note here is that so we are planning to register the unit identifiers themselves as such. Now the question is, how do you indicate when you serialize the CNML using the U field? How do you indicate that you are potentially using different kind of units than were originally proposed in the original RFC? But that, of course, begs you a question. So why do you even need to indicate in the first place? What's the point here? So Colin briefly mentioned about the use case he had in mind in the previous session. So I had a chat with him after the session to get a bit more details on that. So pretty much the use case here is that there are some CNML systems like they've been building in Cisco that they use the CNML unit field for routing CNML records. So if your system is such that you have, say, millions of sensors, they're all sending out CNML, you're trying to push that all in your cloud system. And in the intermediate steps, you want to do filtering, you want to do routing of the information, dispatching, etc. And because the units, if they are consistent, that always when you talk about speed, it's meters per second, period. There's always only one unit for that kind of a measurement. You know that if you see meters per second, it's something about speed. And if you have, for example, an analytics engine or application that only cares about speed, you can conveniently put those records to that direction. Or vice versa, you can filter out information that if you only care about speed and not, for example, radiation, you see a radiation unit or a unit you don't recognize, you can just drop those records from your pipeline and go forward. Of course, you can also use the name field for such a routing, but what this enables that you don't have to know those names a priori or even any information about the names, that you can, for example, dynamically discover new temperature sensors just by looking at the fact that, okay, someone is now sending temperature information. So this was pretty much the assumption in the CNN RFC when we defined the original registry, that we would have one unit for one kind of measurement. As discussed in the previous session, I mean, that assumption didn't hold very well in the end, but we were seeing more and more use for having richer kind of units. And we pretty much agreed, okay, we need a way to support also the richer kind of units. And now the question is like, how do we accommodate these two kind of conflicting requirements? So one way to accommodate that is to have some kind of an indication that, hey, here is a unit where the original assumption doesn't hold anymore. And what you can do with that information, for example, you can raise an error that, hey, there's something happening. I may need to understand it, but I don't. Or perhaps you can reroute that piece of data to someone that might be more capable of understanding. So if you want to cover this use case, we did go and think about different options for doing that. Considered half a dozen different options, going from new versions of ZenML, the U2 field, etc. All of those turned out to be like way too much complexity given like what a simple thing we're trying to achieve here. So pretty much the smallest impact solution that we came up with was actually the one that Carsten briefly proposed in the end of the previous session. I don't know if maybe half jokingly, but still.
No, that was good too.
So putting an asterisk in the field, and basically that would be a flag in the unit that, hey, this unit has different kind of characteristics than the units that used to be in the RFC. So there you see an example, let's say kilometers per hour. You would put an character before, after, a special character that is not used, that you can easily determine that it's not one of the unit characters. Here we're using asterisks for that because it seems to be a safe bet. And then all the units that come from the second registry, you would prefix or suffix them with that flag. Of course, this is not doesn't come for free. Yeah, there's an extra byte of overhead every time you use it. That's not probably really a big issue. If you really care about the last byte, you probably have some form of compression to deal with that anyway. Maybe the bigger issue there is that this does break the principle of least astonishment. So when a developer sees unit, they'll be like, why there's an asterisk? And yeah, they would have to go on to the upcoming RFC and see like, oh, that's the reason. And yeah, it's discussing this between the previous sessions. Yeah, multiple people voiced, okay, that's not very elegant. It kind of smells funny. But out of all the options, this seems to be the best one we get. So I guess that's the last slide here. And questions and comments.
Alexei Melnikov. So in the current registry, there are some units which are derivative.
Correct.
Are they going to be?
So that's a probably, if we were designing that the registry now, yes, they would absolutely be. Is it worth moving them retrospectively and potentially breaking existing code? Maybe not.
Okay, so they're sort of grandfathered and special case. Right?
Exactly, and that's kind of an extra clutch there. I mean, I can see it working both ways, but whether the worth of doing the right thing is worth breaking existing code potentially, maybe not.
Carsten, when I was young and there were still books, in Germany, books have a set price. You cannot sell a book for less than it's set at. But of course, there are books that you want to sell off because you have too much inventory and so on. So what you would do is you take a text marker and scribble on the sides of the book and then say, oh, this is not the normal book, it's a book with a quality problem, and we can sell that cheaper. And the asterisk sounds a little bit like scribbling with a text marker and saying, oh, this is not a real SI-based unit. Yeah, so from that point of view, it's almost something that I might want to start liking. But of course, the problem remains that those people who want to use these units always will see the black text marker on their applications. And this is a little bit of a cognitive problem. I mean, it's not a technical problem, but it's like they are not taking us seriously here. So we have to use the asterisk to say we are the second-class citizens, which they are, but you may not want to rub it in with every usage. So that's one way to look at the thing.
Can I quick comment on the usage, correct? This maximum multiple use for ZenML units, this would only apply to when you use the U field of the serialization.
Yes.
So for example, the OMA use in schema, that would not be impacted by this.
Correct. So the other thing, the objective was to distinguish units from table 1 from units from table 2, which is pretty much what the asterisk does. Now, with the assumption that the units from table 1 are really moving very slowly, I mean, we are not going to register a lot of units there, unless DSI system changes again or something like that. That leads to the simple implementation strategy to look up the name, and if it's not in table 1, it apparently is in table 2. And so you can derive essentially the same information by doing that. And actually, if there ever is a new registration in table 1, the application that is doing the routing based on units probably would have to react the same way because it doesn't really know whether the newly registered unit in table 1 concerns it or not. From first principles, it probably maybe shouldn't.
Yeah, that actually depends. So there's two things in table 1. As you said, like, yeah, it's very, very stable, and assumption is that doesn't change much, except for the half a dozen units we're now adding there. But in the longer term, in a few years, it's going to be rather stable. The second thing is that I think it's more important for this use case that like one unit for one kind of measurement. So there will never be another meter per second, or let's say kilometers per hour, or anything new for speed.
I'm just talking about the detection of the use of table 2.
Yes.
The code with that would look for an asterisk, and the code I would write would look in table 1 and say, if it's not in table 1, it's a table 2 unit.
Yep. And I think that's a fair way to do it. Of course, it's I guess Cullen's argument for that would be roughly asterisk is one line of code that I can easily fold into the system. That would be 10 lines of code with a lookup table. Maybe 5.
1.
All right, okay, that's going to be a long line of code, but...
Yep, so I would just like, as a reviewer of this draft also, I mean, to me, I was one of these astonished people. To me, it looks really bad as a solution. I mean, and even the author seems to disagree on the actual choice. Even you proposed it, but you're not 100% sure about this. The target for ZenML is not just routing entities that are processing ZenML, it's also consumers of any consumer of the ZenML data. It might be that you parse it in different ways, but having that asterisk there means like anytime you print it, just like when you print JSON, you will have that too. Maybe unless you do some special string operation, it means also that if your product has kilometers per hour for some reason, because not everybody has to use meters per second, or you will also have to process that in a different way. And I think it's kind of weird to embed this kind of IETF registry decisions into the SNML unit itself, like whether you have one registry or two. That for most people don't care about that, I think. So personally, I think it's a bad idea. Jaime.
From the floor. Let me try to, if I remember all those points, try to address them maybe in reverse chronological order. It's not actually only about table 1, table 2, it's about the semantics of that unit registry that we're indicating. And it's really the key thing is that is it only one unit per kind of measurement? And now we are breaking that. And also, as Colin pointed out in the, in the previous session, SNML was never meant to be human readable. Just turned out to be because we use JSON. So a normal human being, developers aside, is never supposed to see SNML as such. Of course, in practice, that's often not happens. And yet the asterisk you would never, so that to a user you would always strip that away in your code. So maybe what it looks like on the wire is mostly for knowledgeable developers who will be astonished given, but maybe it's a rather small set of users. And then finally, in one of them, SNML can be used in various different ways, and it's been used in various different ways. One of the core principles, or also stated in the RFC, was that it's highly capable, highly useful for these kind of environments where you have a lot of sensor nodes sending data to the cloud systems. And there, these kind of routing capabilities are very useful. Of course, now the question is that useful? Is that use case important enough to justify the ugliness? And I'm kind of here on the fence. I was originally quite a bit against doing anything. It's just like, okay, let's put everything as such. After a long discussion with Colin, I was kind of starting to, okay, I understand his use case. I think it's a relevant use case. I'd like to cover that. Then the question is like the pain of doing it worth it? And that's kind of, I'm on the fence here myself. I'd be fine either way, actually, as long as we get it done.
Maybe just to get a sense of the room, does anyone have, has anyone read the draft? That's the first thing. Yep. All right. Of those who have read the draft, do you have a strong opinion, one direction or another, that you would like to voice out? I'm assuming not, if you don't say anything.
Hi, my name is Matt Gilmore. Is the asterisk needed? It's got to be expected that SNML in general will have additional units added over time.
Yeah.
So the argument that there won't be a secondary table or additional units in table 1, there's no versioning on that to understand if that changed or not anyway.
So the key difference is the asterisk tells you this might be about a measurement that you should care about, but you don't know. That's really the information the asterisk gives you. So, but
that's going to happen whether I add a new unit or not.
Nope. So that shouldn't happen, because in table 1, you would never have new unit for speed. Whereas in table 2, you may have multiple units for speed.
Okay, I think my point stands, though. You're going to have new units.
Yes, but so you're going to have new units for new kinds of measurements. But as long as your system only cares about a single, or let's say a subset of kinds of measurements that are in table 1, then it actually does bring you value.
But it seems like you're using an asterisk to say, look in table 2.
That's one way you can use the asterisk. Probably more often you would just like, hey, raising a flag. I might be doing something stupid here by ignoring these records. That's kind of the simplest use case for it. Yeah, but then you're right. You could also use, look up in table 2, forward your data to someone who can look at table 2. But really the key thing is avoiding the fact that someone thinks I'm getting all about speed, but then actually missing kilometers per hour. And when I say someone, I'm thinking of, analytics system data dispatching, etc.
Yeah, we have to wrap this up so we have enough time for the applications part. My proposal would be that we generate a new version of the draft that explains this implementation strategy, explains how it is broken by table 2, and also explains how doing a lookup in table 1 is almost giving you the same function back. And I think with that, we should consider this done.
Mm-hmm. And then should we, in order to facilitate that, proactively register more stuff in table 1 that we know is highly likely landing there? Because now we're going to do it by request, what we saw being used. Because now, in order for that strategy to work efficiently, the table 1 should be as stable as possible.
Okay. That's maybe a worthwhile thing. I wouldn't couple it time-wise because that will take some time. Sure. But I think simply leafing through ISO IEC 80,000 and seeing which other combinations are actually defined as quantities and units there might be a good basis. And doing this proactively also really makes the life easier of people who want particle counts per square meter, whatever stuff that we don't do yet.
Events per hour per square meter.
Events per second per square meter.
Oh, absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Yes. That sounds good. I mean, if others, you send an email before the meeting, right? And if others have opinions, they can also just voice it on the mailing list as well. So let's cut it there, I guess, because everything has been said about this issue already, I think.
Yeah. So I picked that as an action item. It's certainly not something that has the highest priority, but I think it should be done.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks.
So let's, because we actually don't have so much time. So Klaus, please.
Can actually scour with this thing. Yes.
Amazing.
There you are.
Okay, I have a number of items in this segment. One item is report on the core application site meeting that happened on Tuesday. Then I have somewhere a quick update on the core-related drafts, which are working group documents here in core. And then related to that, quickly an overview of all the Corel-based applications that we are currently having in different working groups. So let's start with the site meeting that we had on Tuesday. In the site meeting, we looked at 3 topics. The first one was problem details for co-op APIs. That's a proposal by Thomas Rosati. He finally wrote up what has been discussed quite often already in various hallway meetings. And that is when you build the co-op-based application and you return some error to the client, then you might want to include some problem details in that error description. And for HTTP, there's RFC 7807, which defines a JSON-based format. And Thomas converted this to CBOR, but also did some changes by making the format less specific to HTTP and more generally applicable. So it also works in constrained environments. This draft wasn't published before the ID cutoff. That's why it's not on the agenda of the core meeting, but was on the agenda of the site meeting. But now that the submission is open again, Thomas has published his draft. And I think he would welcome any kind of feedback on his proposal. I think it's a quite useful addition to have in our repository of core data formats. So please take a look and tell us on the mailing list what you think, if it's useful, and if yes, how you might use it in your application, for example. Then, of course, my favorite question is always, can you do it with Corel? And so we spent a few minutes in the side meeting to take a look how problem details might be done with Corel. And it turns out, as long as the problem details are simply a list of key value pairs, which is the case in most examples that we could find, then yes, you can easily use Corel for this. And the current Corel draft -01 also has a new section on what does it mean when you return a Corel document in an error response. So normally a Corel document describes is a representation of a resource, but if it's not a representation of a resource, because it's part of an error response, then what does it mean? And that's what this new section defines. Then the next part in the that's not very general. Thank you. The next part of the side meeting was about the extensibility and code points. So of course, when you define your problem details, you might want to have some kind of compact error codes for the different error conditions that can happen in your application. And you might also want to include some application-specific error details in the error message. And then we have the typical problem of how do we do extensibility in this data format. And it's becoming more and more apparent that this is basically the common theme of almost everything we do here in the core working group. We need to assign small, compact, unique identifiers to the semantic elements of our data formats. So if we have these error types and error attributes and problem details, and Thomas has a proposal in his draft how to allocate unique identifiers for that using IANA registries. But of course, we also have already SIDs for COMI or CoreConf, which uses this three-level approach based on mega ranges that are assigned by IANA, then ranges which can be delegated by IANA to someone else, like an SDO. And then with that range, there are the units as allocated. And of course, also in Corel, we want to have link relation types and operation types and form fields, and those need to have unique identifiers, and we want to have them compact. And so Corel has another completely different approach to this. It uses URIs primarily to identify the semantic identifiers, but then defines a static dictionary compression scheme to make it very compact on the wire. So this segment of the side meeting was mostly about this observation. We have this pattern or this problem coming up all the time, again and again. And sometimes a registry is exactly what we need for that, in particular if it's conservative protocol extensions that get reviewed a lot and so on. But if we get into areas, for example, like application-specific error codes, then it becomes quickly infeasible to register every possible error condition in any application that might exist somewhere in an IANA registry. So we have to look into these multi-level allocation schemes. And I think we can learn from each other in some way. So that was what that part of the side meeting was about. And we always say there are two hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation and naming. And I think the naming part is often misunderstood. Many people think it's about finding a good name for your new open source project. But I think the naming problem is exactly this. How do we assign code points that are small, compact, and globally unique without requiring everyone to go through a single bottleneck somewhere? The last part of the side meeting was, again, about errors, and this time about co-op response codes. So we have defined this bunch of response codes, five 5.xx and 4.xx, which are largely inspired by HTTP. And like in HTTP, those response codes are almost exclusively intended for describing protocol level errors. So if there's something wrong with the co-op message format, you would return a 4.00 response, for example. If there's something wrong with an option, you return a bad option response, and so on. But there are very few, if at all, response codes if something goes wrong at the application layer. So a client might send a request that is perfectly fine from the point of view of co-op, but the payload, if it's a post, for example, might not be acceptable from the application point of view because it's malformed CBOR or it contains some key value pairs that are not recognized by the application. So we discussed a bit if we maybe should have some kind of new response codes which are dedicated to application level errors rather than the protocol level errors. And there were some arguments against and for that. So maybe we can continue this discussion on the mailing list.
The part that you're leaving out here is that in the fetch patch document RFC 8132, we already have registered 2 of these, which are 409 for doing something that would leave the data in an inconsistent state, called conflict in HTTP, and 422, which is unprocessable entity, which means something has been sent to you in the request that you cannot process. So that's certainly not the whole picture, but we have already started doing that, and we either should decide that we immediately should stop doing that or that this is a good thing, and we probably will continue this until all 32 error codes are gone, and then we are done.
Another observation related to error responses is that in many of our drafts, when we define interfaces, we often say this is the success case. So you might get a 201 created, for example, for some API call. And these are the error cases. So many documents then say, well, if the resource cannot be found, then return a 404. If the client is not authorized, return a 403. If there's a bad option, return a 402, and so on. And I'm wondering if we need to repeat that all the time in every single API documentation. So we discussed a bit if we could have a central place somewhere where we describe all these conditions when you are supposed to return what. And then in particular ACE documents, I think, like to do this. Maybe those can just reference this single document instead of having all the boilerplate text explaining that if the resource doesn't exist, then you should return a 404. So that was the report on the site meeting. To those who were there, any additions? No. Then let's move on to the update on Coral. So I published -01 of both the Coral draft and the href draft before the IETF meeting. There are not big updates this time because I spent more time on updating the drafts that describe Coral-based applications. So that's the next part. So the only change to the Coral draft has been this new section that I mentioned about what does it mean if you include Coral documents in non-205 responses in co-op for error responses and the other success cases. And there have been no changes at all to the href draft. So just as a quick reminder, Coral describes the links and forms of a resource, and the href then defines a CBOR format that you can use to compactly express your URIs. So it's an alternative serialization for URIs. Any questions or comments on Coral? Then let's move on to the Coral-based applications.
Francesca. So not on Coral, but on the previous topic. I was just checking what we do in ACE, just to make sure. And we just specify that when to send the 401 unauthorized message, because that is like in co-op, what unauthorized means or where it comes from is out of scope of co-op. So the application has to define that. But we don't actually define, like we don't actually use all the other, like we kind of say, okay, if it's 401, if the token doesn't validate, then use 401 unauthorized. So for that, specify, like API specifications feel often very repetitive and maybe make something that everybody can reference. I'm not sure that our draft would use that. I think maybe Oscore could have used that, but now it's an RFC, so
maybe it's more on the side of implementation guidance or something like that. We will figure something out. But it's good that you're not having lots of boilerplate text.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And we need to debate on the meaning of 401 because it means the client is not authenticated.
The client is not authorized to perform the requested action. That's unauthorized.
That's 403. Forbidden.
That's 401. 403 is forbidden. I'm reading 7252.
It's confusing.
Can you find in the router?
Are you saying this is not what it should say? Because then it's different.
So apparently we inherited some terminology confusion from HTTP where they often put the word authorization when they mean authentication. I think this is one of those cases. So they have this www.
Oh yeah, the second. So that was the first sentence. The second sentence says the client should not repeat the request without first improving its authentication status to the server. So it says authorized on the first sentence. And
yeah, the first sentence is actually right. Because in some cases, of course, you are authorized to do something without being authenticated. In that case, you don't get a 401, but you get a success code.
Mm-hmm.
But if there is authentication that is a prerequisite to being authorized, then 401 actually is the who are you? And 403 means I know who you are, but you still cannot do that.
Okay.
And I think that it makes sense to differentiate these two error codes.
Okay. So maybe like the terminology in 7252 wasn't very clear, and maybe, that we should have had this discussion before publishing Oscore.
So that's maybe great input for the corrections and clarifications document.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, done. Quick updates on Coral-based applications. These are currently not working group documents anywhere, but they are subject of discussion in T2TRG and in Core, mostly in hallway meetings. And I'm currently aware of 4 applications that use Coral in some way. 3 I'm an author or co-author of, and there's a new 4th one that exists since yesterday, and that I will talk at the end about. The most interesting one probably is the overhaul of the PubSub interface. You probably all are familiar with the core PubSub draft. That hasn't been updated for a while, and the reason for that is, I think at Prague, or maybe even the IETF meeting before that, we discussed splitting the configuration of PubSub topics and the actual publication and subscription to those topics into separate resources. And it took us a while to create a proposal for that, and we discussed that proposal in Montreal in much detail. And now there's also a draft that puts that proposal into text form. Unfortunately, we couldn't get this draft to have feature parity with the current -09 of the PubSub broker draft. So the authors of PubSub need to iterate on this draft a few times until we get that feature parity, and we can simply replace the contents of the current PubSub draft with that updated proposal. Yeah, there are some hopefully helpful figures in the draft which show the structure that we have now. We have a typical collection resource that contains all the different topic configurations, and clients can create new topics by submitting a new initial topic configuration. The server will then, or the broker, which is the server, then creates a new item in this collection which stores the configuration, and you have the usual operations of create, read, update, delete to change and maintain the configuration of topics. And then there's a second separate resource that the broker also creates, and that is then used for the publications and subscriptions. So you can use in this very simple scheme that -9 defines a put or a post to publish your information to the topic, and you use observe to get the notifications when the state of that resource changes. The nice thing about this split is now that we can also have other types of publish-subscribe mechanisms. So for example, you could create your topic and then specify, oh, it's not using this simple put observe mechanism, but instead it uses some other protocol like MQTT, for example, or some other optimized form of co-op PubSub. So for example, in T2TRG, we have this series transfer pattern draft, which reliably gets you all the information that gets published. While, for example, if you use observe, we only have this best effort approach where you get the latest information. So you might want to configure STP series transfer instead of the simple publish subscribe. Can you scroll down a bit? One implication of this change is that we have now something called a half-created topic. We always have the problem that if a topic is created but nothing has been published yet, what's that state of that topic? Because somehow it exists, but at the same time, somehow it doesn't. And I think we have now found a good answer to this problem. After you submit your topic configuration, the broker creates the topic, but subscribers cannot subscribe yet until something has been published. So we have this little state machine. After creation, the topic is called half created. In this state, you can change the configuration or delete the topic again, but you cannot subscribe. You can only publish. And once something has been published for the first time, the topic is fully created and subscribers can subscribe. Yes. Next. Did I miss anything? I don't think so. Any questions or comments or remarks on PubSub?
Well, one comment with my chairhead would be we really want to ship this thing at some point. So we have to make sure that we have the prerequisites in place to do this, and maybe we can come back to that later. We have about 12 minutes left. I think Francesca wanted 5 minutes to talk about OSCOR and ad hoc.
I need about 5 minutes.
Okay, go ahead.
There have been small updates to the Coral Reef draft, mostly to bring it in line in the same with this to the same style that is used in the PubSub draft that I submitted. And this Coral Reef draft describes how you can do well-known core and resource directory with the Coral interface. And then there's also the Data Hub draft in T2TRG, which designs a Coral interface that you can use to store files on a server. So, for example, a firmware update or a suite manifest or a MAT file or whatever you need. And then you can have the typical lookup interface similar to resource directory, where you can filter the list of stored files for something that is interesting to you. So it's a bit like a resource directory, but you store actual files on the server instead of just links that point to other servers. And then last but not least, we have a fourth application now after the figure. And that is draft TLOCA ACE OSCORE Group Manager Admin -01. That -01 has not been published yet. It exists in a HackMD that we created yesterday. And what we did is we took the -00 version of that draft and restructured it a bit so it matches the same structure that this PubSub proposal draft has. So first it describes all the representations and concepts that are related to OSCORE group management, and then describes the interactions with the group manager. And it turns out that this draft is basically identical to the PubSub draft. Of course, it doesn't do PubSub, but it has the same pattern of configuration. So there's a collection resource. You can post a new configuration to that, and then the group manager will create a new resource that stores that configuration for the OSCORE group. And you can create, read, update, delete. So it's essentially exactly the same interface. So now we are wondering, can we refactor this in some way and write another draft that describes the overall pattern? And then the PubSub broker, for example, would fill in his configuration parameters and status parameters. And group management would simply define a different set of configuration parameters. And so we can reuse the same pattern in both drafts.
Can I ask a question? How often do you expect this pattern to emerge?
In concrete applications, twice so far. I'm aware of an Ericsson application that does it too. It's huge. And so it's a pattern that is very frequent. I think it's very useful to have as a general pattern that we can use for different applications. Any questions or comments on that?
Marco Tilocarais, not exactly on this, on the previous part on Coral for responses and even error code maybe. We have yet another draft in Core describing multicast responses for group observations where individual clients are signal about that with a response message, which is an error response, in fact. So probably Coral can be helpful for those kinds of responses too. And about error codes, maybe we can find something even better to indicate exactly that other than 503.
Yeah, so what you call error really is more like a redirect. And we said we don't want to have a redirect at the protocol level because it's something that really an application should be doing. And to do this, the application needs some data. So I think that fits together very, very well.
Okay, anything else on general on Coral? Yes, no, maybe?
I have one thing I would like to. This thing's driving me crazy. Okay, so. Yeah, to get this thing shipped, I think we need to have an idea when we want to ship it. I mean, we can work for 5 more years on this. It's going to get better every year. But maybe we need to ship something at some point to get better feedback from people. And my hunch is that we need approximately 1 IETF to close all these issues that are currently in the repository. Maybe doing this using an issue of the day process. And then when we say, okay, all issues are closed, we have something like an implementation draft that we can recommend people to implement. We take another IETF period to get these implementations, get the feedback, and improve the document based on that feedback. Maybe also get a few reviews from outside the web, the Thing web community into the big web community. So with this timeline, we would shoot for a working group last call in mid-2020. And the question is, of course, do we have the resources to pull this off? But the question, of course, is also, do people see a big problem with this? Should we be faster? But I don't know, we can be. Should we take some more time because things are maybe a bit rougher than I perceive at the moment? So that's where I would love to get some input. For instance, from Jim, who's played a lot with Coral. He did.
He's saying in the chat that href needs to happen also in parallel.
Yes, sorry. So when I say Coral, I always mean these two drafts, the draft IETF core Coral and draft IETF core href.
So I can report that while there weren't many draft updates in the last months since Montreal on Coral, there has been a ton of validation of Coral. So it has been applied to a larger use case internally. And I think the concepts are now rock solid. We are not going to change anything about that. But we have this list of issues that might lead to some tweaks and into that.
So Jim from Jabber, the basics work well. Trying to solve dictionaries is still an issue. And also, do you want to solve the JSON Coral on the same time schedule?
That's an interesting question, yes.
I'm not sure we have enough data to answer that question, but we could try to. We don't know what kinds of problems we run into when we're doing this. I think that's a good question.
We have two proposals for JSON serialization. I think it's just a matter of picking one of those.
Okay.
And that's difficult because both are ugly.
Flip a coin. Okay, Francesca, you wanted to use the last 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Carsten. Hi, I'm Francesca, and I have not prepared slides or any presentation for this, so this is just talking. So for the OSCORE plus EDOC scenario, we are wondering about something. We would like feedback from implementers and also people who have ideas about constrained implementations. I have started talking about this with several people, Klaus, Malisha, Jim, and I would like to hear if more people have opinions. So the issue or the problem statement is for the EDOC protocol, we have 3 messages protocol or exchange. And this third message, so that goes from the client to the server, could be combined with the first OSCORE request that comes after the EDOC protocol. So the question is, how can we combine this third EDOC message with an OSCORE request? And of course, transport all of it in co-op. So we have identified 3 possible solutions, and I've heard several different opinions on this. So Malisha from Sixtish, he said that his preferred option would be to actually transport the EDOC message in an OSCORE protected co-op request. So that would mean adding the ad hoc data or the message 3 or whatever you want to call that into the payload together with the ciphertext and signal it in a way to the server. So this signaling could be done in two different ways. Klaus supported a way where this signaling is done directly into the OSCORE option value. So this would mean that a server would have to parse the option value to be able to realize that in the payload of the co-op message, it's not only the OSCORE ciphertext, but also the ad hoc message 3. And Malisha initially was hesitant about this, and after checking the code, he said that it's fine because he first does parsing of the option, and then afterward he does processing of the option. So that would be fine for him. But Jim had a very strong reaction against this because his code makes this very difficult. So his preferred option would be to send the OSCORE message inside an ad hoc message. Okay, what is an ad hoc message? That's just a co-op message with ad hoc in the payload. So there is ad hoc message 3 in the payload. And what he proposed, and Jim, please correct me if I'm mistaken or misunderstanding, is that together with the ad hoc message 3 in the co-op payload, there will be something signaling that also the OSCORE option value and the OSCORE ciphertext will be contained in that same payload. So what the server would have to do is to take the message, process ad hoc, and the ad hoc processing would also start or would also parse this payload and remove the ciphertext and OSCORE option and put them at the right place so that when the co-op message is processed, the OSCORE option will be added to the message, and then OSCORE can be processed. So if in the first case, the processing would have been, okay, co-op parsing, OSCORE parsing, then ad hoc, then OSCORE processing, then co-op. In the second case, it will be co-op parsing, ad hoc parsing, ad hoc processing, OSCORE parsing, OSCORE processing. So, okay, so this is recorded. So you can go back and listen to it after, but this makes sense. So I am doing this fast because we don't have time, but I think that people who I've talked to have an idea what I'm talking about, I hope. Ari?
Ari, can you send a flow chart on that? I had a bit hard time following.
Yeah, we can sketch this out. But okay, so I have a last option, which I would like to hear from, that Malisha brought up. And he said that this would be his preferred option for him. And so this, and I haven't talked to Jim or Klaus about this, and I would like to hear everybody else comment. That would be to create a new option called ad hoc. This option is sent empty. The only reason for having this option is to say, signal that the ad hoc message 3 is included in the payload. Also, this option will be defined so that, like in the specification, it would say, process this option before processing OSCORE. So that would be an unprotected OSCORE option. So OSCORE would leave it as is. And by processing first before OSCORE, what the server would do would be just to parse the payload, take out the ad hoc, and start the ad hoc processing, which is what Jim didn't like. But yes, so I would like to hear opinions about this. And I think that we have on one side implementation that are constrained and more have co-op more integrated with OSCORE, and on the other side, implementation who are more general and have libraries, and so switching from one library to the other is hard. But yeah.
So we are now in hallway time already, but go ahead, Christian.
Hi. So what I think we should keep in mind with either approach, and for me, either of those three would kind of work, is that what we're doing on a semantic level is sending two separate REST requests. That one is the process this ad hoc message 3, which is usually a post to a particular resource, and then process whatever is in the rest of the message. That we are doing this here. We may short circuit through this process, but we should be aware that this is what we're doing.
Yes, this is exactly what we're doing, yes. And we're trying to do it in a way that implementations can do it without too much pain. So the question is, what's the best option? Klaus?
At some point with OSCOR, we made the decision that we degrade COAP to a simple message forwarding protocol and run OSCOR on top of that. Mm-hmm. And since then, everything is going downhill. I don't think there's a good option here. There are only really bad and really, really bad options.
Okay. So I would something I haven't said. I think it's important is that this will be an optimization. So we still have the option or the default option of running ad hoc first, which runs on top of like transported on in COAP, and then so it's 2 passes and then start running as OSCOR. That's the default. But here we're trying to think, since it's important for 6-dish to have as little round trips as possible, as few round trips as possible, how can we optimize them? So yeah, this is an optimization thing.
Aren't the messages not already filling up the blocks anyway? So you need multiple datagrams?
I don't think so. I think ad hoc message 3 you mentioned was 22 bytes, something like that. So I don't think that, plus the OSCOR request, whatever that is, but OSCOR overhead is like 10 bytes. So I don't think so.
Can
we do
IPv6 over OSCOR next year?
So we can look at that, but okay. But we can take interim on this if you think it's okay.
Yeah, maybe it's worth thinking about piggybacking in a more general sense. I'm not sure that will lead us anywhere, but maybe it does, and then we can use that. But maybe we do something very specific, very ad hoc to solve this problem.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, as I said, we are on the hallway for 7 minutes already. Thank you for your patience, and see you all in the interims and in Vancouver. Maybe I should say that the hallway sentiment was that having an interim meeting every 2 weeks might be a bit too often. So we probably will come up with an interim schedule that's a bit lighter, but we can do that on the mailing list. Have a good trip home.
All good. Chair.